Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Evening.
Tonight, we're going to discuss a subject that doesn't seem to get discussed very much in the media, Hollywood, even history books, and sometimes not even among ourselves. But we're going to talk about it tonight and see if we can't shine a little light on this hidden subject. Now, the subject matter, you've heard it before. You've probably even seen movies about it before, but it was usually about white women going west. The nice title is Westward the Women, but I'm going to be specific on Westward the Black women. And, we live in a city that is the gateway to the West. St. Louis, the arch that's downtown, standing on the mighty Mississippi River, is a monument to the people who went out west during the days of the Westward track, the wagon trains, people trying to get out on the Santa Fe Trail, the get on the Oregon Trail, and going to California, trying to get to the gold rushes. Westward expansion, so many people go west. And many things have been written about some of these people who went west. However, very little has been written and no movies produced about African American women who went west. These Black women went west for different reasons. Even before the end of slavery, some went west as servants or just to start a new life, and some went west as mail order brides. Black women took on a variety of roles, including activists, farmers, pioneers, army wives, gold hunters, and business owners as well. In the 1870s, during the early days after the Civil War, many men of the U.S. colored troops, we call them the Buffalo Soldiers, had wives and they accompanied them to their army posts out west. Buffalo soldiers were stationed in forts in Arizona and West Texas. However, the story of the black mail order bride and black women out west is history that has been kept quiet for many years. And we're going to open the door and let that secret out tonight. We're not going to keep it quiet anymore. Now, many of these stories that are told about women going west has been mostly about young white women from the East Coast who traveled west to marry men who paid their train tickets. They were looking for a new life and hopefully a good man. Hollywood even made a movie about their hardship on the trail going west. And believe it or not, that movie is called Westward the Women. And I've watched that movie. I have that movie. And it's a good movie, but there are no black women in that movie. What's little known is that in Arizona, a western state, this is how many young black women came to the territory. They went to Arizona and California. They went to the mining camps in Arizona. It was filled with young men and even some older men who was widowers whose wives had died. But the married African American women who already lived in the territory decided that there is not enough women in these mining towns for all these men. They found the presence of so many unattached men in their community to be a problem. Because think of it, you're all women, you're all females, and you all know how we men are. Just because you have a husband and I don't have a woman, and it's 10 women to every man, and if all 10 women are married, that's not going to stop the single man from chasing the married woman. Do I sound right in that? That is not going to stop him. Just because you're married and it's not going to do it. So there were just too many men and not enough black women. So black women who were married decided, look, whenever a loose woman came to town, men would go berserk. She wasn't married. So they would fight over her. They would create all sorts of problems in the community. So these black women decided, these married black women decided, let's talk to these men and see if they will be okay with us ordering mail order brides for them. And would they marry these women if we did order these mail order brides? So the old men who were widowers and the young men agreed that yes, we will marry them if you bring them. And so if you build it, they will come. And so that is exactly what happened. These young women from all over the country, mostly the West, most of the East, I'm sorry, women came in from St. Louis, Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, New York. These women range in age from 20 years to 40 years old. They responded. They was filled with hope and hoping to find a life that they didn't have where they live. Many of these women lived in poverty. They had family problems or they had some personal tragedies, and they were trying to get away from all of that hardship. And so each sought a new American dream. They sought a new beginning. They hoped to find the thrill of love, the warmth of a family, and a new life better than what they were leaving. So these women was ordered through the Sears and Roebuck catalog. Can you believe it? Sears and Roebuck used to sell women or mail order brides to men who wanted one. Good old Sears. That was probably the best thing they ever did for those men out west in those mining camps. However, they did have a problem. When the trains showed up and all these beautiful black women got off of those trains, and they were no older than 40 years old and no younger than 20, there were a whole bunch of men. And no one had decided how are we going to pick what woman to go with what man? Because the women would decided that they would do the picking. They said we're gonna do the picking. However, the men met, and they decided that the oldest men who had been in the training in those camps the longest would be the first choice. They would pick the women they want, and the younger men get what's left. And you know what that meant. You know exactly what that meant. The miners met before the trains even left the eastern station, decided the picking would be done by the older men who controlled the camp. And the oldest men picked who? Guess who they picked? The older men picked the youngest women. Often found themselves, the young women found themselves being married to men old enough to be their fathers, and in some cases, their grandfathers. Most of the older men, wives had died, and they were left with children. So these older men wasn't looking for romance. They were looking for people to raise their children. So a lot of these young women ended up with a house full of children that they had to raise. Some of these men was, like I said, they was old guys, and even old guys today, and you call him a dirty old man because he liked to look at the young women. And so they had the dirty old guys back then too. But these old guys had a reason for picking these younger women. They needed a young, strong woman because what had happened out west in those days, women didn't live very long. Death took its toll on the frontier women due to harsh and unsanitary conditions, especially after repeated childbirth without having any doctors around. There wasn't any doctors there. So a lot of these young women or these older men wives end up dying and leaving them with kids. And it was very hard for these old fellas to work in the mine 12 hours a day with no one watching their children. So not trying to make an excuse for these guys, but they needed a permanent babysitter. And so marrying these young women who were strong and robust and had a lot of energy, they found the babysitters they was looking for. But many of these young brides found themselves with ready-made families and multi-children. The mail order bride had to work from dawn to dusk in the fields and in the home to make their marriages a success. It wasn't an easy life, but these women were used to making something out of nothing because Black women have always been able to make something out of nothing in this country. They've never had an easy life. They were very resourceful, raising food, making clothing, and taking care of their family. Like everywhere else in the country, they faced challenges, including racial prejudice, discrimination, and harsh realities of frontier life. Frontier life, in case you don't know,
Oh,
it really wasn't like the movies, where the women all had on the buzzles and the little bonnets and they just walked around town and had a lot to say about nothing. Or they worked in saloons or worked as a seamstress in a dressmaking shop. Frontier life was very hard for all women. It was very hard because they had to do the things that nobody else would do. Just think about it. Men went to work in a mine, which is hard work in itself. Have you ever swung an axe or a shovel for 12 hours a day underground? You know what I mean. So he didn't have time to be worrying about will the crops, the garden that we grow for our food, will that grow? Who's going to take care of the cows and the cattle? Who's going to take care of the pigs and the chickens? Who's going to take care of the children? Who's going to cook the food? Who's going to clean the house? So that was the things that the women did. And it was hard work, especially for women coming from St. Louis, Philadelphia. Now, notice where I said these women come from. They came from big cities who lived in big cities. St. Louis City in the 1870s and 1880s, St. Louis was a city. It was a hustling, bustling city, just like you see now, minus cars. But they didn't have pigs and chickens and all that stuff on most of these streets in the Mill Creek Valley. Chicago was the same way. New York was the same way. Philadelphia was the same way. So when these women came to this frontier life, it was a rude awakening that the big city life was no more. Now she got to learn how to work not so much a country life, but a frontiersman's life. She got to become a frontierswoman, learning how to use a firearm to protect from critters like snakes and coyotes and wolves and bears, and even some two-legged coyotes, wolves, and bears. So she had a hard life. And now that was a harsh reality that they had to face. A lot of these women faced those realities. They made well out of their marriages, especially the young women who married the young men. Some of those young women and young men created great lives together. The husband was a miner, and she lived with him. She had his children, and they raised good families. And not all the women who went out west were mail order brides, just so you know. I just wanted to highlight that particular chapter of our history that cities like Arizona, not cities, but states like Arizona, around those mining camps, especially where the Black men were at, because see, they had mining camps in California as well. They had mining camps in San Francisco era. You hear all about the football team called the 49ers. Well, the 49ers are named after a gold rush that happened in that area in 1849. And mostly it was white men, and they had ordered brides. But there were some black men in those 49er camps. But the white men were so racist and so prejudiced against them, they didn't stay there very long. They end up leaving, and they end up going to the Arizona mines where black men were there in abundance. And therefore, they needed women, people. We can't live without women, regardless of whatever they say. That's a lie. Men and women are designed to cohabitate, and we can't live without you. Now that's an amen right there. I'm like, Pastor, now that's an amen. But anyway, not all the women who went out west were mail order brides. Many were already married, and they followed their husbands out west on wagon trains. Some opened businesses, some became wealthy. Black women who settled in Denver and Los Angeles preferred urban life to rural living. And I've spoke about that already. Rural living was rough. Urban life is what most of them who came from the big cities was already living. So they preferred urban life. And it helped to increase the population of those great cities. To be honest with you, when they started counting the black people who was moving into Los Angeles and Denver, Colorado. It pushed the population growth high. Those cities didn't have very many people, but after all these black people started moving in, especially black women started coming in, it increased their populations and put them on the map permanently as large cities go. And since most of the black women who went west was from the cities of the East, now this is something that I even was shocked by. Since most of the black women who went west was from the East and the cities of the East, they were more educated than the white women who went west as well. Because black women, we had, and say, we just take St. Louis, for instance. Some of the schools that taught black people have been here a long time. They're not operational now, most of them not, but some of them are. You know, like Sumner was, Beaumont was, uh, and we even had during slavery, we had people teaching black people how to read and write and cipher and whatever you want to call it. But anyway, the Westward movement of African American women lasted from the 1870s until the turn of the century. And what I mean the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century. Now, I have a list of some of these black women I want to read off to you guys. Some of these black women, I have some names. We had this lady, her name was Biddy Mason. She was a slave who fought for her family's freedom and later became a prominent figure in Los Angeles. We had Elizabeth Thorne Scott Flood, a teacher dedicated to educating black children and improving their lives. We had Mary Ellen Pleasant. She decided to become a civil rights crusader and a successful businesswoman. We had Mary Fields, also known as Stagecoach Mary. She was a trailblazer who worked as a mail carrier. And her story goes deeper than this, but that's a story for another day. We had Susie Sumner Revels Clayton. She was a writer and an editor. And then we had another one named Abby Fisher. She was a cook and she wrote cookbooks. I also have some information here about some other black women that was out west. We had one black woman, and this is I could never find her name. I looked and I tried to find her name, but the only name they gave was the name of her husband, Mrs. Simon Casper. She was a bride at 13. She was a mail order bride. She was one of those young ones who snuck in there. She became a bride at 13. She had 8 children, and she was a miner and worked in the mine, the gold mines, right next to her husband. So she was doing that real rough work. There are other women that we have that was out west. Older women who traveled westward, most of them had money. The older women, the younger women didn't have anything, but the older women did. They went out west, and some of them became very wealthy women because remember now, they're going out west, they're going to the gold areas where they're searching for gold. And a lot of these men found gold, and a lot of these men was willing to give gold up to these women because they fell in love with these women. And y'all are women, and y'all know what men will do for you guys. They'll give you gold and diamonds and anything else you want if you're what they want. That's just the life we live. We had one woman named Lutetia Parsons. She became a nurse for the Buffalo Soldiers in the Arizona base in 1870. We had another one named Mary Lewis. She was of Tucson, Arizona. And she became a wealthy woman in Tucson, Arizona. Western black married women were 5 times as likely to be employed as white women, and twice as likely to be married as Asian or Native American women. Paid labor for whites would span time between arrival and marriage or serve as a mark of independence. For black women, it was an unrivaled burden. They overwhelmingly preferred city to rural work, even though most were confined to jobs as house servants, cleaners, and midwives. Although it was common for white town fathers to locate houses of prostitution in black neighborhoods. In other words, they wouldn't put the prostitution brothels in their neighborhoods, but they was put them in the black neighborhood. Now, census figures established that very few black women, now I want you all to listen to this and take this to heart. Even though they located those brothels in the black neighborhood, the census figures established that very few black women became prostitutes. So, not very many black women took up that line of work. Some women born or married into rural families grew to love frontier life. One woman named Eunice Russell Norris became a Colorado cowgirl. She was so helpful in building a family log cabin and saw and stove wood. Her father and grandfather affectionately called her a son because she worked just as hard as any boy. I could go on and on and on, but I'm sure you guys have a few things to say. Black women worked in those gold mines. Black women built churches. Black women in those towns built schools. They were high on the social ladder in those communities. And if you go to Arizona, California, Colorado, you will find that the neighborhoods that was predominantly black in the late 1800s was mostly a child of black women who left the East going West. They was trying to get away from the racism, the poverty. I mean, there were women who act literally starved to death living in some of these cities. At one time, St. Louis was so bad Most people don't know this, but St. Louis in 1872 or 3, there were so many prostitutes downtown St. Louis until the mayor had to create an ordinance to really get rid of prostitution and close down the brothels that was on Olive and that was on uh, Shodo. They had brothels on Olive and Shodo. They had brothels over there right where the well, I always call it the Kiel Opera House. They didn't change the name a bunch of times, but so you know what I'm talking about, where the Kiel Opera House is located, near the train station. They had brothels like crazy. So a lot of these women was being forced to do these things by different people. And so a lot of these women decided to go west to get away from those type of lifestyles. It wasn't beautiful living in poverty in these big cities. You had to do what you had to do to survive. And these younger women just didn't want to grow up and do what they had seen other women do. So they decided to move, leave, go out west, seek their fortune, marry a young man or an old man. And if they didn't go to marry, they opened their own businesses. They dug for gold too. They was part of the gold digging crew. And some of them became well-to-do people. Are there any questions?
Lee, on that first name you gave us, last name Mason. What was the first name?
Biddy, Biddy.
Thank you. Okay.
Lee, I don't have a question that's very interesting. When you started off, that color purple Miss Seeley came to mind. And I was like, okay, Miss Seeley had to marry a man and take care of his children too. But I
Yeah,
just found that to be very interesting. I wrote down some of those names too, and I'm going to look them up. Thanks for sharing.
yeah, yeah. That was part of the one of the reasons why a lot of these older men, and when I say older men, y'all got to remember now. In those days, if you reached 60 years old, you was lucky. Okay, if you were a minor and you reached 60 years old, you were lucky. If you were a 50-year-old man marrying a 21 or 22-year-old woman, you were an old man. Okay, because the life expectancy in the 1870s for a man was about 45 years old. And that's a life expectancy. Oh, yes, some lived longer, but the average man in the 1800s never saw a 60th birthday. So when even though you hear and I read that some of these men was grandfathers and fathers, well, that's because women and men got married at early stages in life back then. And by the time a 20-year-old man turned 40, he probably had some grandchildren already. So that's the gist of that. So don't think I'm talking about some 80-year-old man or some 70-year-old man married with some young woman, because that's not really what happened. They use that terminology because actually that is what they were. They were grandfathers and they were old enough to be some of these people's fathers. I mean, because if you're a 20-year-old girl, like I read the one to you, the 13-year-old girl who got married who had the 8 kids. Now just think about she's 13, she got 8 kids, and each kid is by the time she was 28, she had 8 kids. And her father had to be no, he couldn't have been that old. So anyway, any other questions? I got my head filled up with this information, so y'all ask me some questions.
I think it was just very informative. I was sitting here with my mouth open and my mind blown, and it brought back so many just thoughts, kind of like Miss Roz mentioned the color purple. And I think about how when I'm speaking with other people, around my age, and we're talking about how our family dynamic was, how many people, our grandparents had, 9 and 13 and 15 and 20 children, and how it just seemed to be the norm versus now where that's not so much what happens. And it's coming together and making sense now. So I just appreciate the information.
Yeah, because black women used to have a lot of kids. I'm number 12 of 13. I'm number 12 of 13. My mother had actually 13 babies that lived. She had 14 children, one passed in childbirth. And if my mother would be alive today, she'd be 105 years old. So my mother got married in 1932 or 3, I think 33. And she married a man that was not old enough to be her father, but he was about 15 years older than my mother. My father was about 15. Ted, to show you how it was, my father was born in 1898, and my mother was born in 1915. So that is a case of what I'm talking about. Okay? He was in his 30s, she was 18. And my father, uh, he was married to my mother until he passed away. They had a good marriage, but they produced a whole bunch of children. And there were plenty of black women who had a whole bunch of children because we were living in the South and we was living on a farm. And when you can't hire people, mama makes some workers. Mama made a bunch of boys. She made 7 boys, and them 7 boys helped that old man work on that farm. And those girls did too. We had 6 girls too. So they helped mama out a lot as they got older. And she was a young woman having babies. And she wasn't that young because I think when I was born, I think she was maybe 40, 41, something like that. But that is a normal thing. But black women have been strong physically, mentally, spiritually, forever. As you notice, black women are the backbone of many institutions in our society today. They're the backbone of our religious institution. If you go to any African American church in this country, in any state, any hamlet, any village, any town, the vast majority of parishioners in that church will be African American women. And that didn't just start in the 20th century. It was that way in the 19th century as well. So don't ever let anybody sell you guys short. You know, don't let anybody ever tell you that we black men don't respect our black women because we do. We love y'all and we respect y'all. And we know we wouldn't be who we are or where we are without you. And that was the same way it was in the 1800s, in the 1700s, during slavery. And that's the same way it is now. But anyway, let me stop being long-winded and give me some more questions. Go ahead on, Gail.
I would imagine since there was the Sears and Roebuck catalog back then, that white settlers were ordering up black wives as well.
No,
No,
no black wives, no. Because peer pressure and the community that they lived in just wasn't going to have that. It was two wives that the white men didn't. Now, there were isolated cases where white men did have a black wife. Okay. There were isolated cases where a white man did have a Native American wife. But on a normal community, that was frowned upon because they didn't want the white men out west. Out west, the most hated minority wasn't black people. It was Native Americans and Mexicans. And the white men wouldn't marry Native Americans or Mexicans. And the black people had experienced slavery, so they weren't even trying to marry anybody white. They didn't really have much to do with it. Now, if you would be down in the southern states, the most hated minority was black people. But see, out west, there was very few black people. That's the reason why they had to migrate out west, because out west, for the most part, was non-slavery. There was no slaves out west. The West wasn't really settled until after the Civil War. Okay. And when the Civil War was over with, there was no slaves. So the majority of black women who went out west were free women who just came from these hard time cities across the East and the Midwest. But as far as the interracial marriages, and they had those misogynist laws as well. They had the laws where white men, most people, this is the thing that most people, especially our African American brothers and sisters, they are under the impression that that particular law that outlawed interracial marriages was made just for black people not to marry white people. Well, that's not true. That's an urban legend. That law meant that it was geared toward white men, for white men who lived in areas that was heavily populated by, I'll say Hispanics, but it was mostly Mexicans, populated by Hispanics, populated by Native Americans, populated by Chinese. Okay, those were the minorities minus black people in the 1800s. You didn't have all the stuff you got today. You had the Chinese, you had the Mexicans, you had the Native Americans, and you had black people. And all four of those minority groups were out there. It was outlawed for white men to marry them, and vice versa, for them to marry white men or white women. It could be white woman, whatever. But those races was not supposed to mix. And out west, we always hear that, well, down south you couldn't marry them. It was like that out west as well.
So what I was getting at, the point of ordering from the catalog, you
Yes.
had to marry that woman. If you ordered a mail order bride, they were forced to marry.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. That was the law. You had to send her some bona fides that you want to marry, and her pictures was put in the catalog, so you saw what you was getting. Your picture was put in the catalog. May not be really you. You know how people can switch around and get somebody else. But once you had signed all that paperwork to be a mail order bride, you had to marry the man that ordered you from that catalog.
Interesting.
Because Wells Fargo was the delivery service. Wells Fargo, and then the train service. You had to marry. You couldn't, in other words, you couldn't come under false pretenses and say 20 women say they're gonna marry men in Arizona, in Tucson, Arizona, and then 20 women come out there, and when they get there, the men are ugly and raggedy and no, I'm not marrying you. Nope, they're not gonna have 20 loose women walking around the town of Tucson, Arizona, because somebody's gonna get killed.
Hmm.
So, and for her protection, she was best to marry. Another thing I didn't mention, but it wasn't like it is today. In the 1800s, during the Victorian period, women was not safe on the streets of those towns. Single women were not safe. So she couldn't be on the street at night by herself. When the sun set, she went home because you had all sorts of bad actors out there. And the laws were not woman friendly like they are today. You know, you something happened to a woman out there, it just happened, and if they didn't really look too much for who did it. So that was one of the reasons why when they came to those towns, they had to marry the men that they came to marry. They couldn't, just use this as an excuse to leave Philadelphia so I can just go to Arizona and I'm gonna kick it up when I get to Arizona. No, you can't do, no, that wasn't gonna happen.
Well, Lee, I'm gonna ask this one question. How much was Sears selling these women for? And I'm not gonna ask nothing else.
Well, Sears, it just depended. It just depended that you could take $50 to order you a bride. $50, and now let's think that $50 was a lot of money back in 1880, okay, for a working man. But if he could come up with $50, because he had to pay for everything. He had to pay for her train ticket out there. He had to pay for paperwork and stuff. And so $50 will get her out there.
Okay.
Now that was I guess I'm trying to think of the word to use, but that was on just basic passage. But if you happen to be some well-to-do man and you didn't want your wife to be sitting up there by the engine smelling all that smoke, because that's where they had black people at. They were right behind the man that's shoveling the coal. They in that very next car where they smell all the coal smoke. But if you was well-to-do and you could send her $100, then she could sit back in the very back of the train and didn't have to smell any of that smoke. And she had a sleeping car and she could sleep in her car. And she came out of there like a queen compared to the
Oh,
ones that was at the $50.
all right then. Thank you.
Okay, so Lee, I have a question about the women that were in the mining towns that were sending for these women, the young and the old women. How did they weren't mail ordered. They were just sending for, how did they send for the women that they were bringing to the town for the men?
Well, they were mail ordered. They was mail ordered, but they was mail ordered by the older women of the. Well, let me say it like this: the older married women got tired of being bothered by these
Right.
single men. So
Uh-huh.
they convinced these single men and these widowed men to participate in mail order brides.
I got
But
you.
what they did, they wrote to churches
Okay.
in those towns.
Okay.
They didn't just go.
They wasn't doing Sears Roebuck. They
No,
was
they wasn't doing Sears Roebuck.
Gotcha.
They didn't
Okay.
just, they didn't just go to Sears Roebuck because they didn't just want any type of woman.
Gotcha.
They
Okay.
wanted good, wholesome girls who God fearing, who had learned about right and wrong and to honor father and husband and all that stuff. So they wrote letters to churches in those areas and asked those churches to petition the women of their congregation who didn't have husbands.
Mm-hmm.
But the husband still had to come up with the same amount of money, to send them from St. Louis to Arizona.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. And the other thing I wanted to say is I was looking up Biddy Mason. She was smart as she could be, man, and she
Oh yeah.
she even founded the first church in Los Angeles. I was like, wow, she did a whole lot for her to have been enslaved in the beginning, but what became free. She was in medicine, childcare, livestock, and she was a real estate entrepreneur. I was like, all right now. So
Oh yeah.
we got a lot to learn. You gave us some equipment we can look up and find some stuff. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, a lot of these women, like I said, all of them didn't just come as mail order brides. Some of them, they found ways on their own to go west. And they hooked up with, sometimes they even rode along with the mail order bride but she wasn't the one that was ordered. And, her life was a little harder because she had to make a living on her own. But most of them end up doing business. They came up with some type of business, and if these women who came without being mail ordered, if they came along with the mail ordered bride, they was taken care of by the town mothers, the black town mothers, who were the churchgoers, who were the mothers of the churches and the sisters of the church. They would find a place for her. They would let her live with them until she get her act together, until she decides she want to marry somebody, or she decides to do whatever she's going to do. Because they knew just what I said. You were not protected out there by yourself as a woman. Like I said, today is a different thing, but in that day, a woman without a husband was nothing but prime attack bait. Somebody gonna attack her.
Brother Robinson, I had a question earlier. You talked about, there was not any intermarriage, I'm sorry, during that time period. So when Black women went out there, for example, if they did not find a husband, excuse me 1 second, I let this dog outside, so I'm gonna check on her. Come on in. I apologize for that, you all.
Mhm.
So when a Black woman, for example, if she went out there and she wasn't picked or she didn't find a husband or what have you, is that to say that did she just remain single, or did maybe some of the white men, even though they wouldn't marry her, would they have sexual relations with her and possibly, impregnate her or whatever? So whether or
Yes.
not they would marry her, that's what I was thinking, because I know, we have so many different mulattoes in the interracial, children because of that. And I'm sure a lot of it may not have been consensual. So whether they married a Black woman or not, that doesn't mean that they did not have sex with them and possibly produce some children from their, encounter.
That's very true. That some of them they that did not find husbands, or for some reason the husband died or whatever reason, but they stayed single. They got single. They became laundries. They became servants at white folks' houses. That's how they worked. They became servants at white people's houses. And yes, a lot of them did get impregnated by white men because a lot of them were raped. Or like that's why I kept saying I didn't want to use that terminology, but I'll use it. That's why I kept saying she wasn't safe on the streets by herself. That's what I mean. I didn't mean somebody was going to kill her. I mean somebody was going to molest her. And most of the molesting of women in mining camps and mining towns and cow towns in that time period were white men doing the raping. Okay, so if some black woman who white men have always loved y'all black women. I know why, but they always have. And they they're not going to try to come and talk to you and make you their wife and girlfriend and their date in the daytime because all of their buddies are looking. Okay? Because peer pressure is lead that black woman alone.
Mm.
But as soon as that sun went down, if he caught a black woman out somewhere, he would either give her a choice. Either you volunteer to do this or he'll rape you. And so I hate to say this, but it's true. There were black women who secretly had love affair relationship with these white men.
Mm.
They welcomed them in their homes, the single ones, because she's still a woman and she want a man. So that's what she did. But you're
And
right, that did happen. That's why you have so many. There were so many like that.
and that was the point I was coming to with the catalog orders. Uh, men ordering women just for that purpose to have a sexual companion if they paid for you, because women were still considered property.
Yeah, but not that type of property. After the Proclamation Emancipation Proclamation, she was never that type of property again. If you ordered her, you had to marry her. If you shunned her, then you had to send her back.
Mm.
You couldn't just order you a pretty woman and she's just gonna live up in my house. No, that's not gonna happen. We didn't have no shacking back then.
Mm.
And if you did have it, it was under the table. Nobody knew because the marshals and the deputies and the sheriffs, if they found out, they would force you to send her back
So
because it was
Sears,
against the law.
so Sears Roebuck did have some social conscience
Oh
about.
yes, oh yeah, oh yes. That was because the mail order bride started with white women, and
Mhm.
when they started it, it was just for white women. But after black people became free, then we got the same rights, and we had to follow the same rules as the white people. Before then, there were no mail order brides. Before freedom, black folks didn't have any rights to travel across this country and go nowhere. You had no right to do that. And especially a black woman. She had no right to even leave the plantation. So, but after the war was over with, all that old slavery law crap was gone. Now you're governed by the laws that everybody else governed by. I mean, after I put it like this, after the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment was passed to the U.S. Constitution, you became a 100% full-fledged American citizen. And therefore, every law that they had written, you had to abide by. Before then, no. But yeah, you had some interracial stuff. It happened to the Native Americans, it happened to the Mexican American, it happened to the African American. They had names for every man. If a white man married a Native American woman, he was a squaw man. That's a racist term, but that's what they used. This is a history lesson, so I'm going to use historical language. I'm not going to try to sugarcoat it. Okay? And if you were messing with a white man messing with a black woman, he had a negress. That's how they terminated that. And if he had a Mexican woman, he had him a Chiquita. That's just the way it worked. And these men did not want that knowledge known, you know, to their coworkers, buddies, and what have you. So they snuck around and did it. That doesn't mean they didn't mess with him. It just means they didn't want to bring them home and make them their wives. That's all.
Brother
You did.
Robinson, I need clarity on something. And I'm thinking about that they extended the same rights and opportunities to the black women as they did certainly as they did the white women. And I'm really being facetious in that. I find that very interesting because if I'm not mistaken, I might have this year wrong, but and correct me if I am. I thought in 1897 they had the Plessy versus Ferguson court ruling, so with the separate but equal, that doctrine, remember? So they had that, in place. Was it in 1897?
Yes.
Okay.
And that doctrine didn't have nothing to do with marriage. It had to do with social things. It had to do with schools and churches and
Okay.
and living
Okay.
living areas
Okay.
like that because it actually depended on your state. Uh,
Okay.
New York State, uh, Massachusetts, uh, Connecticut, and Vermont, Rhode Island. Uh, uh, yeah, I'm trying to think of the state now. I can't think of the state, but most of your northeastern states, you can marry whoever you wanted. You can marry. You could. That was where most of the interracial marriages went. They would get married and they would go to the Northeast because the laws were the same for all places, except states decide to make laws against certain things. Federal law, federal law didn't ban. Federal law doesn't have anything to say about who you marry.
Mhm.
It's the state that has something to say about who you marry. You know, it's like marriage is not in the Constitution. They don't care nothing about who you marry in the Constitution. But states had something to say about it. And because some states had less minorities than others, the white people just figured it was best not to have a white man walking around with the people they considered inferior as his wife or husband. That's because they knew it was gonna bring problems. And quiet as it's kept, most of that stuff was to route out problems before they happen. Because you guys gotta think of it from this angle. If you're in a town, most of these towns that I'm talking about had 200 people at the most in the early days. And if 165 of them are all white and the rest of them are different minorities, those minorities are going to have some problems with those people. And so one of them 165 white men go marry one of those 25 black people. His peers, most of them came from the South after the Civil War. That's who feel a lot of things people don't know. Most of the people who feel the West came from the South after the Civil War. That just because the Civil War was over with, it didn't change their attitudes toward black people. So just because I live in Arizona now, that doesn't mean I don't still think like I live in Tennessee, because they did. And so if some white man had married a black woman in that time period, that white man was going to have problems. And so the laws in those areas was trying to head off trouble, even though they was based on race and it was racist laws. Because all racist laws wasn't made just to discriminate against black people. A lot of those laws was made because they didn't want to have race riots and battles and burnings and hangings, and so they just figured, you know what, we just not gonna do that. Anyway, before we go, I got one thing. If you guys are interested, uh, there's a book called Black Women of the Old West by William Loren Katz. You can get it at Amazon, or you can even buy it down there at the Arch. If you go down to the Arch and where they got the historical museum downstairs, and you know they got their museums, they sell books by William Loren Katz. This is one. I don't know if you guys can see that. It's backwards, but that's one of the books. This is just the Black West. It talks about all the black people. But yes, that's one of the books. And they have another book called The Best in the West. And its story is all about African Americans. So that will conclude our lesson. But Natalie, I got something I need to tell you.
Yes, sir.
If I can find it, I got all this paper here. Let me see if I can find this. Oh, okay. Our next history lesson will be the original Black Panthers. That's what it's called.
Okay, I'm excited for that.
Huh?
Not that I'm not excited for all of them, but
But yeah, it's the original Black Panthers. Let me look at my calendar real quick.
okay. Let me see. That should take us into May, right?
I think it's in the May.
Okay.
May 21.
May 21. All right, the original Black Panthers, May 21st, 7 p.m.
That's it.
I'll get you set up. Thank you so
Yes.
much for tonight's class, Mr. Robinson. Another wonderful, wonderful expedition into your mind. I truly appreciate how you take the time to put these together for us, present them to us, and allow us to share insight and ask questions.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
I can definitely appreciate this, especially being a young woman outside of school age, but still having the opportunity to learn. And we
Yes.
appreciate you.
Yeah, because sometimes when I do the research, I'm learning myself. And Gail, I hope you enjoyed this.
They didn't teach us this in high school, Lee.
Okay.
And I
Yeah.
got a different perspective on the Sears catalog now.
I know, me too, Mr. Robinson.
Yeah.
I know you're closing out, but I did have a question about that.
What? Go
Um,
ahead on.
because the women were, the age ranges. Who were putting the women up for sale in the catalog? Was this something that they were volunteering themselves to do, or was it
Yes,
their
yes.
parents?
Right. You know how in the Old West they would put a flyer out like a wanted poster.
Mhm.
Okay.
A wanted poster would say young women 20 to 40 years old interested in marriage to men seeking fortune, gold hunters in the mines of Arizona, California, Colorado, and contact this number. And it's an address, it wasn't a phone number. You write a letter, tell them you're interested, get your name on the list, and then they took it from there.
Wow. Okay.
And let me correct you, they really wasn't buying the women, they were just paying for them to come out west.
Got it. Okay.
Oh,
Cause yeah, cause she could always, when she got out west, if she had money in her jeans, she could jump back on the train and go back.
so basically, the women allowed this to happen.
Yes, they wanted this to happen. It was all
Got it.
voluntary. It was all
Mm.
voluntary. You know, if you think about it like this, and then I'm gonna let you go. You're a young woman living in St. Louis in poverty on Shodo. Everybody around you's just about starving, and you sick of it, and you've never been any place, and you see that flyer on the St. Louis Public Library, and you meet all those criteria. I want to get away from this mess that I live in. You sign up for it. Same reason a lot of men join the military. They get sick of what they're doing and they go. So that's how that happened.
That makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that.